Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 15th chapter in the book of Proverbs, and there's a lot to cover here, so we're going to keep our preamble to the bare necessities. Proverbs is a literary device, which is a pithy saying of condensed wisdom. In other words, it packs a punch and is more than the sum of its own part. It says as much as possible while saying as little as possible. So the opening verse reads, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up displeasure." Now, many of the proverbs are arranged antithetically, whereby one item will be presented and then juxtaposed according to its opposite. So a soft answer and harsh words are clearly opposites, and a soft answer can mitigate conflict and restore peace and harmony, but a harsh word is a source of commotion and contention. "The tongue of the wise makes knowledge good, but the mouth of fools pours out foolishness." This is a self-evident statement. How we speak is a reflection of who we are, and how we think, ergo, it is a reflection of our nature. And good people will use good words, positive, uplifting, whereas the fools, they just can't help themselves. They will spew foolishness because they are unable to escape their foolish nature. "The eyes of Yahweh are in every place, watching the evil and the good." This is commensurate with his attribute of omnipresence as the creator of the world. He is, this is not to confuse it with the erroneous extreme of pantheism, whereas every item in creation is divine, but he is capable of seeing all, knowing all, and being anywhere he needs to be at the present moment. "A healing tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it crushes the spirit." Tree of life is a reference to Eden, whereby they were commanded, Adam and through him, Eve, were commanded to refrain. There's their sole solitary commandment from eating from the tree of life, according to which their knowledge of good and evil manifested, and they grew a conscience in a moral sense of right and wrong. But in this context, tree of life is more like a source of life. So a healing tongue brings life, it brings restoration, it brings healing, it brings wholeness. But perverseness, contrarily, crushes the spirit, and there's perverseness, rightly so, compares unfavorably to healing tongue. "A fool despises his father's discipline, but he who heeds reproof is clever." Now, throughout the book of Proverbs, which is addressed to his son, it is questionable to the extent which Solomon was writing with posterity in mind. He reiterates the fifth commandment, which is the respect for parents, and a fool will not see the value or prudence in embracing discipline, but he who embraces it and sees it for what it is, it's not to injure them, it's to help them, are identified as clever, whereas those who disrespect and despise parental discipline are foolish. "The household of the righteous is a great treasure, but in the income of the wicked is trouble." So righteousness instills the great treasure, whereas income of the wickedness is born in trouble, brings trouble, and creates more trouble. "The lips of the wise scatter knowledge, but the heart of fools is not so." Now, maybe the fool would like to be able to distribute knowledge, but the fact is their foolish nature and character prevents them from being able to do such, whereas the lips, the words of the wise, are able to do so because they are wise. "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to Yahweh, but the prayer of the straight is his delight." So sacrifices were prescribed for atonement from sin, and throughout the majority of its history, Israel had no trouble performing the mechanics of the motion of sacrifice, but they were not forgiven by the sacrifice per se. They were forgiven by the faith which compelled them to execute the commandment. And much of the prophets, Isaiah's first chapter and several other places, speak of the waywardness and apostasy of mechanical observance to religious rites, which neglect the weightier matters. But the prayer of the straight or upright is acceptable and pleasing to him, whereas the sacrifice of the wicked is null and void and effectively meaningless because it does not stimulate any desire, any pleasure in Yahweh to see them do what they do. The way of the wicked is an abomination to Yahweh, but he loves him who pursues righteousness. Now, pursuing righteousness requires one to have an appetite for righteousness, and in Matthew 5:6, we read that those who hunger and thirst after righteousness will be satisfied. But the way of the wicked is the broad, to return once more to the Sermon of the Mount, Matthew 7:14 or thereabout. The way of the wicked is the way to destruction, and it is broad, whereas the way to salvation is narrow. Discipline is grievous to him who forsakes the way. He who hates reproof dies. So discipline, once more, is an item of concern for Solomon, and the fact is that it is grievous to those who forsake the way, because they will be self-oriented creatures, and as such will resent the imposition of pain on their behalf for a productive purpose. But discipline is identified as a matter of life and death, ergo we must embrace discipline if we are to embrace life. The grave and destruction are before Yahweh. How much before the hearts of the sons of men? Grave and destruction are, in this context, are indicative of hell, which remains under Yahweh's control, but we have a lot more to be worried about landing in that dreaded destination. A scoffer does not love his reprover, nor does he go to the wise. Now, a scoffer is one who treats trivially that which should be taken seriously, so they will not embrace discipline, and they will not seek out the conversation and the counsel of the wise who can correct them to amend the errors of their ways. A glad heart makes good a face, but by sorrow of heart the spirit is stricken. These are self-evident statements which demand little explanation or elaboration. A good heart springs from makes good, and sorrow strikens the heart and afflicts it with pain. The heart of the understanding one seeks knowledge, but the mouth of the fools feed on folly. Now, understanding is the next stage of knowledge, but it is built on the foundation of knowledge. Knowledge is the ability to acquire and accumulate information. Understanding is the ability to piece it all together. But once more, by the antithetical juxtaposition of the fools, the mouth of the fool feeds on folly. That's because their appetite is for foolishness, and they don't know any better, and they don't know that they don't know any better. All the days of the afflicted are evil, but gladness of heart is a continual feast. So he's identifying pleasure in heart to a continual feast which does not end and does not upset and is everlasting. But the days of the afflicted are very much evil, and their lives are defined by evil, and their character and nature are very much evil. Better is a little with the fear of Yahweh than great treasure with trouble. So there is nothing wrong. There is no source of disappointment or anything of that lines amongst the fear and reverence of Yahweh. But the accumulation of wealth and treasures can conceivably lead to trouble. So wealth in itself is not a sin, but is very often the source of sins. Better is a meal of vegetables where love is than a fatted calf with hatred. So the spirit with which governs the meal is more important than the dietary items they are presented. So in other words, it's better to eat measly vegetables and in the company of those who love you and you love them. And then it is to eat fatted calf with those who hate you and are your enemies and seek your destruction. A man of wrath stirs up strife, but he who is a patient appeases strife. This brings us back to the opening verse. Patient people appease strife. That means they comply with it to an acceptable extent and are pragmatic in their approach to the reality of the fact of evil's existence in the world. But a man of wrath, testament to their nature, they stir up commotion, they stir up contention, they stir up conflict, and it's all rooted in wrath and anger. The way of a lazy one is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the straight is a highway. So the laziness and idleness, Solomon doesn't have much kind words to say about people who embody that spirit and that ethos. But uprightness is linked and connected to prosperity throughout the Old Testament. A wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother. So the family dynamics are such that a wise son is the source of delight and pride for a father, whereas a wicked son will detest and disrespect and despise their mother. So they're in violation of the fifth commandment, which is to honor and respect thy father and mother. Folly is joy to one lacking heart, but a man of understanding walks straight. So fools pursue foolish pursuits in the vain expectation that they will bring satisfaction and happiness. They would not do otherwise if they did not think so. But the path of folly is very often a source of greater trouble to come, which awaits them. And a man of understanding, testament to their nature, will walk straight, whereby which we understand the path to salvation is straight and narrow. And without counsel, plans are nullified, but by great counselors they are established. Now Solomon, as a royal ruler and a king and a monarch, would have depended on counsel to advise him how to proceed. He would assess the advice which was presented to him, and he was the decider, but in order to decide properly necessitated the presence of advisors, and Israel was no exception. Every head of state is invariably advised as to the course of action. They are the deciders. They act on the advice they receive. And in the absence of counsel, any plans are for naught. But with the quality and quantity of counselors, they may be created and put into motion and established in momentum. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and how good is a word in its season. So there's appropriate time and place for the utterance of certain words, and when the timing is right, that is a source of delight and joy. The path of life is upward for the wise, to turn away from the grave below. So there are two possible outcomes which await us in the afterlife, heaven or hell, and the sad fact is that the majority of humanity is destined for hell, not because Yahweh desires it. He takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked, Ezekiel 33:11, and 1 Peter, somewhere in there. Yahweh tears down the house of the proud, and he establishes the boundary of the widow. So the Torah, or the law of Israel, was to be reflective of Yahweh's concern for the most vulnerable in society. And widows were very much, the nation of Israel was commanded to be concerned for them and to accommodate their needs. Evil thoughts are an abomination to Yahweh, but pleasant works are clean. This is another self-evident statement which demands little explanation or elaboration, but for now it suffices to say that evil thoughts precipitate evil actions, ergo, as a man thinks, so he is, and so he will be. He who is greedy for gain troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes live. So greed is an unnecessary sin, one of the 7 deadly sins, according to, I suppose it's a Christian list of the 7 deadly sins. But bribes are a source of temptation for anyone in wielding power or influence in order to take shortcuts to receive favor, but he who hates bribes and does not partake in them and does not encourage them will live. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil. So any situation demands reflection and analysis, and this is what the wise people do. They assess certain situations according to the facts and according to advice and premonitions they have received. But the mouth of the foolish pours out evil. That is because wickedness is foolishness, and little do the fools know that they are pursuing with the path of pleasure, which will soon be frustrated. Yahweh is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. So the prayers of Yahweh are identified elsewhere in the book of Proverbs as a source of abomination to Yahweh, but the righteous do not have to worry about accessing and approaching Elohim. And in fact, the author of Hebrews encourages us to come to the throne boldly in the 4th chapter, in the 16th verse of that book. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart. A good report gives marrow to the bones. So a positive or optimistic report is a source of delight and satisfaction, and as our an ear that hears the reproof of life dwells among the wise. So this once more brings us back to the 10th verse, which in that wise people will seek out reproof and correction and discipline, whereas the fool will avoid them like the plague, not seeing their remedial value or seeing it for what it is or what it can do or even its greater purpose. Discipline is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The purpose of administering pain or suffering is not for its own sake, but to instill discipline in those who need correction. He who ignores discipline hates himself, but he who listens to reproof gets understanding. Now, the outstanding irony is that the self-centered creature who supposedly loves himself and treasures his life above all else on earth is, in fact, and as such will ignore and avoid discipline, in fact, very much hates themselves because they are not willing to embrace that which is for their long-term benefit. The fear of Yahweh is the discipline of wisdom, and before esteem is humility. Now, throughout various locations in the book of Proverbs and throughout the Old Testament, the fear of Yahweh is identified as the source and wellspring of wisdom. Ergo, we must fear and reverence the omniscient one who is the source of all wisdom and knowledge in order to acquire what he deigns to provide us with. Testament to our capabilities and our responsible response patterns. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.